Most HR departments in Nigeria still assume that labor litigation comes from the usual places: wrongful termination disputes, unpaid benefits, or disciplinary procedures that went wrong. That assumption is becoming dangerously outdated. The next wave of labor litigation is emerging from a very different direction, and many organizations have not yet recognized where the pressure is building. For decades, employment disputes in Nigeria were relatively predictable. Courts largely focused on the contract between the employer and employee. If the employer acted within the terms of that agreement, the decision was often upheld. HR policies across many organizations were designed around this basic principle: follow the contract, and the risk of litigation remains manageable. That framework is gradually fading. Something significant is changing in Nigerian labor jurisprudence, and its implications are only beginning to surface. The National Industrial Court of Nigeria is increasingly approaching employment disputes from a different perspective. Rather than restricting itself strictly to the agreement between the parties, the court now asks a broader question: was the employer's conduct fair? This shift may appear small, but it fundamentally changes the grounds on which employment disputes are decided. In earlier years, the written contract was the central reference point. Today, the court is increasingly willing to examine workplace conduct through the lens of unfair labor practice, employee dignity, and international best practices in labor relations. That means a decision that technically complies with the employment contract may still face legal scrutiny if the surrounding circumstances suggest unfairness. Many HR departments have not fully adjusted to this change. Policies are still drafted primarily around contractual compliance, notice periods, disciplinary clauses, termination provisions, and internal procedures. What is often missing is a deeper assessment of how workplace decisions may be perceived when examined through broader fairness standards. This is where the next wave of litigation is likely to emerge. Issues that were once considered routine management decisions are now attracting greater judicial attention. Long-term casualization of workers, indefinite suspensions without pay, workplace practices that indirectly penalize vulnerable employees, and internal policies that significantly alter an employee's working conditions are increasingly being questioned before the court. What makes this development particularly important is the legal foundation behind it. The National Industrial Court is empowered under the Constitution to apply international best practices in labor relations. In practical terms, this has given the court considerable room to examine employment relationships beyond the strict wording of the contract. As a result, employment disputes are no longer confined to whether an employer technically complied with internal policy. The court is increasingly willing to examine whether the overall conduct of the employer aligns with evolving standards of fairness in the workplace. For HR leaders who continue to operate under the older contractual framework, this creates a blind spot. The risk is not simply that policies may be challenged in court. The deeper challenge is that the criteria by which workplace decisions are judged is expanding. A decision that appears administratively correct within the company's internal framework may still be vulnerable when assessed through broader labor standards. This is why the next wave of labor litigation in Nigeria may not arise from dramatic or obvious violations. Instead, it is more likely to come from ordinary workplace practices that have gone unquestioned for years. Many organizations are still preparing for yesterday's disputes. The courts, however, are already dealing with tomorrow's.